Titson has a one-line entry in Wikipedia as a hamlet near Marham Church. The latter boasts just over 600 souls and is near the more well-known Bude. Its main claim to fame is that it holds the Marham Church revels on the first Monday after the 12th of August, in which a local schoolgirl is chosen by her contemporaries to be the queen of the revels. This is followed by a procession and all the fun of the fair. But let us return to Titson. In 1928, it contained a rather eccentric character called Richard Francis Rodley, who lived alone in a rather squalid cottage in Titson. He was a well-known misogynist, but generous to children. Like a lot of recluses of his type, his cottage was filled up with junk from auctions on the grounds that they could prove useful. As he was known to withdraw £50 from a local bank on each visit, he was rumoured to be rich. Tempting target, you would say. Over to you, James, to recount this ghastly story.
On the morning of the 18th of February 1928, Richard Rodley's curtains had not been opened, and a neighbour went round to his cottage only to find the victim lying on the floor with a blanket over his head. On removing the blanket, he discovered that the head was covered in blood. A doctor was summoned, and Rodley died later that evening. He had been hit with a blunt instrument. There were some clues, such as footprints in the mud outside, which were made into casts. A number of the victims' trunks had been slit open. There was a rumour of a Morris car in the vicinity. In a small hamlet like Titson, it is relatively easy to cross-reference all witnesses. In the first interview, almost all statements have to be taken at face value, with one exception, which we will cover later. But as the police cross-reference names, dates, location and time, the second interview becomes more tricky, as happened in the case of William John Maynard, a 36-year-old rabbit catcher. He was quite successful in his trade, as he was able to employ two men. Even though he could not account for his whereabouts on the fateful night in question, he was released and sent back home in a police car. On arrival, he collapsed and had to be returned to the police station. Obviously, he had to be examined by a doctor, who was dismissive of his behaviour. He lay on the ground clutching a blanket and moaning. Exceptionally, the magistrates visited him rather than the other way round. As a result of this interview, he was transported to Exeter Prison and was able to go to court and answer questions in a coherent manner. He gave a reasonable explanation for his whereabouts on the night in question, as he was trying to catch a pigeon for supper and returned home later that evening, where he met his wife and a Bert Yo. Excellent alibi if confirmed by the others. But things started to go wrong, as his written statement was unclear as to Bert Yo's actual presence at the house. But even worse was to come. His wife testified in court in front of her husband that he had not returned that evening. As Maynard was facing the gallows, his wife's testimony showed new meaning to that hackneyed phrase, "till death us do part." Maybe time to make another statement. He did, and in it Maynard admitted that he was part of a two-party gang that intended to rob the victim with a local small-time villain called Harris, who was the ringleader of this group. Harris entered the house and bludgeoned the old man to death. Under the law at the time, he could still hang, as he was part of the gang that committed the deed. Once again, there was no honour among thieves, as Harris was able to show a cast-iron alibi. However, he contradicted Maynard's claim and said it was Maynard who kept asking him to rob Richard Rodley. Harris had known the victim all his life. Bear in mind that Harris had a criminal record and was facing the noose if his story could not be corroborated. Attention now centred on Bert Yo. He made an earlier statement to the police that he had met Maynard that night after being prompted. Later he retracted this statement, saying that he had not met him that evening. But was this enough to hang a man? But damning evidence soon followed. Maynard, in an earlier statement, said that he had stuffed a blood-stained cap down a rabbit hole. This was found, and one of Maynard's labourers confirmed that it did indeed belong to Maynard. He had 2 bank accounts, of which one was in credit and the other in debt. He had paid £40 into the overdrawn one, so his finances were not so desperate. The magistrates' court and the assizes covered the same ground, so his reprieve depended upon the Criminal Court of Appeal. It was very difficult to pin the blame on greed, as nobody was pressing him for money, and there was a wallet containing cash beside the victim. The defence used that old tactic of police intimidation. It was true that he had been held in police custody for 24 hours without sleep before making the alleged statement. Even though he was literate, the police produced 3 pages of foolscap paper which had been edited. There was the question of the identity of the cap. The Lords of Appeal stated that the judge had erred in this matter, but felt it was irrelevant. On the 27th of July 1928, he was executed at Exeter Prison by Thomas Pierpoint. Now, John, can you pull a rabbit out of the hat with your conclusion?
What is one to make of this story? The characters sound like a down-market version of Cluedo. Instead of a colonel and a professor, we have a rabbit trapper and a chimney sweep. Maynard's finances were a mess, but that is typical of a number of self-employed people. Staff were never paid on a regular basis, and his relationship with his 2 banks were mixed. He employed 2 men in his rabbit trapping business and had property and animals. He could be described as asset-rich and cash-poor. Unless the victim spells out the murderer's name or the actual culprit confesses all at the police station, the police are faced with the daunting task of locating witnesses, checking their identities and cross-referencing their statements. In a big city, this is impossible. In a place as small as Titson, it is achievable. C.K. Chesterton once remarked that the best place to hide a leaf was in a tree. A true recluse cannot live in a village, as everyone knows everyone's business, including the fact that you live on your own, go to the auctions and are generous to children. Your neighbours even know that your blinds are not in the normal position. In a city, a true recluse would be found months later, as the neighbours dislike the smell. There is the curious story of Maynard's relationship to the petty crook Harris. Did they do a spotted burglary on the side? And Harris's objection was his long-standing relationship to the victim. Why would Maynard pester Harris about doing a spotted burglary unless both knew they were capable of such an act? One is struck by the speed in which the crime occurred and the date of the execution. It was only 5 months. If you want to know more about this and other West Country murders, or catch up on all our previous episodes from the podcast series, please visit our website vintagemurders.uk or our YouTube channel.